The ballroom of the Copley Plaza Hotel shimmered under the weight of 1,000 prismatic lights cast by enormous crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with the faint scent of lilies and expensive perfume, a rich tapestry of sound woven from the hum of 100 animated conversations, the polite clinking of silverware on china, and the subdued, elegant strains of a string quartet in the corner. It was a world of polished marble, glittering gowns, and tailored tuxedos. A world that felt entirely foreign to Sarah White. She stood near one of the grand arched doorways, a ghost in her simple black cocktail dress. It was the only formal attire she owned, a modest piece of fabric that felt like a costume in this parade of high fashion. Sarah was 28, a freelance American Sign Language interpreter, and tonight, her job was to be an available yet unobtrusive resource for the Seattle Children's Hospital Charity Gala. She was instructed to blend into the background, a professional ghost, ready to materialize only if someone required her services. She needed this job desperately. Her student loan payments loomed over her, a constant low-level dread, and her freelance work had proven to be less stable than she had hoped when she left her permanent position at the local school district. As she watched the elite of Boston mingle, a feeling of deep-seated invisibility settled over her. She was here, yet she wasn't a part of anything. She was a silent observer in a loud room, and the irony was not lost on her. It was in that moment of profound detachment that her eyes caught a fleeting, powerful image in the far corner of the ballroom. A teenage girl, perhaps 16 or 17, stood partially obscured by a massive fluted marble column. She wore a stunning midnight blue dress that contrasted sharply with the vibrant colors of the crowd, but it wasn't her attire that drew Sarah's attention. It was her stillness. While everyone around her laughed and gesticulated wildly, the girl remained perfectly composed, her hands at her sides. Her posture held a subtle tension, a slight rigidity in her shoulders that spoke of a practiced, polite indifference. She watched the lips of those around her, her gaze intelligent and watchful, but her own expression was a careful, neutral mask. Sarah knew immediately what no one else in the room seemed to notice. The girl was deaf, and she was utterly, completely alone. A ripple of excitement, almost a physical wave, surged through the crowd. It was a change in the room's emotional temperature, an energy that radiated from the main entrance. Daniel Hunt, the celebrated tech billionaire and the evening's guest of honor, had arrived. He was a tall man, commanding in his presence, with salt and pepper hair and a confident, easy smile that seemed to charm every person who met his gaze. His company, Hunt Innovations, had donated millions to the Children's Hospital's new wing, and he moved through the throng like royalty. Photographers' flashes illuminated his path, and a chorus of voices called his name. Wealthy donors jostled for a chance to shake his hand, to bask in his reflected glory. Sarah felt a pang of curiosity and, without thinking, glanced back at the girl in blue. She was watching him, her father, a complex mixture of pride and resignation in her eyes. Not once did Hunt look in her direction. Not once did anyone approach the girl. A deep sense of determination took root in Sarah's chest. In her work at the hospital, she had seen countless children isolated by their conditions, but never had she witnessed such complete loneliness amidst so much privilege. She took a steadying breath, the soft rustle of her dress a faint sound in her own ears, and began to cross the room. The crowd, like water, parted around her, their conversations flowing around the silent island she navigated. As she neared the corner, the girl's eyes widened slightly in surprise, a momentary break in the careful facade she had maintained all evening. Sarah reached her, and without hesitation, her hands began to move. The graceful, practiced shapes of a greeting formed in the air, a bridge across the chasm of silence that separated them. The girl's face transformed instantly, the guarded mask melting away to reveal a smile of such genuine delight that it made Sarah's own heart ache with a strange mix of sorrow and relief. It was a smile she had not seen on this girl before. a smile that had been hidden away for what felt like far too long. As Sarah's hand movements formed the simple, universally understood greeting, a palpable shock registered on the girl's face. It was a fleeting yet profound expression that melted almost instantly into a look of cautious curiosity. The ballroom's incessant din of laughter and conversation seemed to fade into a distant buzz, becoming nothing more than white noise in the space that now existed only between them. The girl's eyes, which had been so carefully detached from the world around her, were now fixed solely on Sarah's hands, following each graceful curve and motion with an intense, almost desperate focus. Sarah continued, her fingers dancing through the practiced signs of a simple introduction. She watched as a cascade of emotions washed over the girl's features. The rigid tension in her shoulders began to dissipate, and the polite, indifferent mask she had worn all evening cracked, then shattered, revealing a vibrant, expressive young woman beneath. The corners of her lips twitched into a hesitant, then a full, beaming smile. A smile so radiant and genuine that it seemed to illuminate the corner of the ballroom where they stood. It was an unspoken question on the girl's face, a silent astonishment that someone had seen her, that someone had spoken to her in a language that was truly her own. With a motion that was both quick and elegant, the girl's own hands began to sign. Her movements were fluid, revealing a natural grace and comfort with the language that came from years of fluent use. Sarah followed the signs, understanding perfectly the silent words that were spoken with such heartfelt gratitude. It was a conversation without sound, a silent ballet of hands and expressions that flowed between them, creating a private, secluded world in the midst of the public chaos. The girl's eyes sparkled with a newfound joy as she explained how she had been watching people's lips all night, a tiresome and isolating exercise. She described the frustrating attempts of hearing people to communicate with her, the exaggerated, almost comical motions they made, as if she were a child. A silent laugh escaped her, a gesture of hands and a fleeting smile that conveyed a profound sense of shared understanding. She spoke of the common yet maddening habit of people who, upon learning of her deafness, immediately turned to her father or another hearing person to continue the conversation, as if she had suddenly ceased to exist. As they communicated, Sarah's focus narrowed completely. The vast, luxurious ballroom with its glittering guests and high-stakes networking faded into a blurry backdrop. The loud, boisterous soundscape of the gala was a distant, irrelevant thing. The only reality was the movement of hands, the subtle shifts in facial expressions, and the silent, powerful exchange of thoughts and feelings. She learned the girl's name was Lisa, a smart, witty, and surprisingly funny young woman who was starved for genuine connection. The conversation flowed, touching upon Lisa's experiences in her mainstream school, her struggles with being perceived as both an unapproachable rich girl by her peers and a privileged outsider by the deaf community. She spoke of her loneliness with a shrug that did not quite hide the pain. From across the ballroom, a woman with a sharp professional demeanor watched them. She was Daniel Hunt's assistant, a woman in her 40s with a tablet clutched in her hand. Her gaze was not curious, but professional and cold, her eyes taking in the scene with a calculating air. She observed the breach in professional conduct, the sign language interpreter who had stepped beyond her designated role. A silent note was made, a mental checkmark on a list of rules that had been broken. Meanwhile, oblivious to the watchful eyes, Daniel Hunt himself was being pulled in multiple directions. He was a force of nature in his own right, and the current of conversation and influence flowed around him relentlessly. As he was led toward a group of reporters, he happened to glance briefly toward his daughter's corner. He saw her, not as a solitary, detached figure, but in animated conversation with the interpreter. A flicker of something, perhaps confusion or a brief, unformed curiosity, crossed his face. But the moment was gone as quickly as it had arrived. A flashbulb erupted, a hand reached for his, and his attention was immediately absorbed back into the business of being a public figure. He was no longer a father, just a powerful symbol, and the quiet, momentous exchange happening just yards away was swallowed by the demands of his world. As the moment stretched on, the bubble of understanding that Sarah and Lisa had created began to feel fragile. The weight of the ballroom, with all its expectations and pressures, started to press in on them again. The feeling of invisibility that Sarah had experienced earlier was now tinged with a new, sharper sensation: the awareness that she had committed a professional transgression. She had stepped out of the shadows and made a choice that could have serious consequences. The pleasant hum of the crowd now felt like a low, threatening rumble. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that her brief act of humanity would not go unnoticed. For a moment, she had been a friend, not a ghost. But the world outside their silent conversation was real, and it was about to remind her of that fact in the harshest possible way. The conversation drew to a natural close, and as Sarah and Lisa parted ways, the feeling of quiet rebellion gave way to a dawning realization that the evening was far from over, and her simple, kind gesture had set in motion something far bigger than herself. The call had come just an hour before, delivered in the terse, no-nonsense tone of a corporate assistant. Sarah was to present herself at the offices of Hunt Innovations, and she was to do so immediately. The location itself was a monument to wealth and power, a sleek skyscraper that pierced the gray Boston skyline. Sarah's trembling fingers and a knot of dread in her stomach felt starkly out of place as she stepped out of the elevator and was led down a long, silent corridor. Her mind raced with the potential scenarios, each one more humiliating than the last. A formal reprimand for her unprofessional conduct, a termination of her contract, a cold, clinical lecture on the importance of maintaining appropriate professional boundaries, the possibility of losing her freelance clients, a lifeline in her precarious financial situation, loomed over her. The door to Daniel Hunt's office opened, and Sarah was ushered into a space that felt less like a workspace and more like a museum exhibit. It was a vast, minimalist room defined by clean lines, polished wood, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city below. The art on the walls was stark and abstract, perfectly complementing the room's austere beauty. Sarah's eyes were drawn to one piece in particular, a large canvas with bold sweeps of cobalt and gold that seemed to pulse with a hidden, powerful energy, a striking contrast to the more subdued pieces around it. She felt a strange, immediate connection to it, a sense of familiarity she could not place. A housekeeper who had led her to the office noticed her lingering gaze. The woman's voice was a soft, almost reverent murmur as she explained that it was a work by his daughter, a testament to her profound talent. Daniel Hunt stood as she entered, a towering figure of authority. He gestured for her to sit, and his demeanor was coolly professional, a blank mask that betrayed no hint of the anger she expected. Sarah took the offered chair, her back ramrod straight, preparing herself for the inevitable lecture, or perhaps a demand that she sign a non-disclosure agreement. She rehearsed the words of her apology in her mind, her voice ready to explain her actions. But he didn't speak a word of reprimand. Instead, his next words were a shocking and utterly disarming admission. He owed her an apology. Sarah's prepared defense crumbled, replaced by a profound sense of confusion. He spoke of her words at the gala, admitting they were blunt and inappropriate for the setting, but not, he confessed, inaccurate. A flicker of something, a hint of shame, crossed his face before it was quickly masked. He had been made aware, he said, that he had failed his daughter in significant ways. The vulnerability in his voice, the raw humility in his confession, caught Sarah completely off guard. He gestured for her to continue her silence. This was his turn to speak, and his words poured forth with a quiet, careful control that revealed the years he had spent burying this particular pain. He described the car accident, the suddenness of the black ice, the sickening impact, the silence that followed. His voice was clinical and detached as he recounted the terrible facts. His wife, gone instantly, and his daughter, a small 7-year-old girl in the back seat, waking up in a hospital room to a world that had fallen completely silent. For years, he admitted, he had been obsessed with one goal: to fix her. He had consulted specialists, pursued every experimental surgery, and thrown millions of dollars at the problem, convinced that he could somehow undo the trauma, that he could restore her hearing and, in doing so, erase the guilt that gnawed at him. He had become a business person organizing a project, and the project was his daughter. He had hired interpreters, tutors, and therapists, people he paid to communicate with her, to bridge a gap he was too broken to cross himself. He reached for a framed photograph on his desk, his hand steady as he turned it so she could see. It was a picture of a younger, vibrant couple with a small, beaming child. He spoke of his wife, a concert pianist, who believed music was just one language among many, and how she had taught their daughter sign language from the time she was an infant. The house, he said, was once full of music. After the accident, he couldn't bear to hear it anymore. He had sold his wife's piano, stopped playing the records she loved, and in his grief, had convinced himself that he was protecting his daughter from painful reminders. But perhaps, he admitted, he was only protecting himself. He straightened, his composure returning, the business magnate re-engaging. He wanted to hire her, he said, not as an interpreter for his daughter, but as a teacher for him. He should have learned years ago, he confessed. He was prepared to commit to regular lessons, a minimum of twice a week, and he named a figure for her compensation that was so substantial it made her eyes widen in shock. It would solve all her financial problems, overnight. But money, she realized, was not the primary currency in this transaction. Sarah looked at him, a powerful man who had built a vast empire, yet stood emotionally bankrupt in his own home. She had to ask the question, the one that hung in the air between them. Why now? He looked away, out the window at the distant skyline, a man unaccustomed to such vulnerability. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. Last night, he said, he had seen his daughter's face when Sarah had signed to her. He had not seen her look that alive in years. And this morning, his daughter had left him a note on his desk, a small, folded piece of paper with a handwritten message that spoke of being heard, of true healing, and of a long-standing silence. He had spent years, he repeated, throwing money at his daughter's deafness, funding research and building education wings, while failing to make the one investment that truly mattered. He looked back at Sarah, a flicker of hope in his eyes. It was not too late, he said. He was ready to do whatever it took. The high school gallery was a stark and modern space, a blank canvas now filled with the vibrant energy of student art. The air was a mix of fresh paint and nervous excitement, a world away from the cold, polished marble of the corporate gala. Proud parents milled about, their voices a constant, low murmur of admiration and encouragement. Sarah arrived early, her heart filled with a quiet sense of anticipation. She found Lisa near the center of the gallery, making final, anxious adjustments to her display. As Sarah approached, Lisa's face broke into a genuine, unguarded smile, a welcome sight. She gestured for Sarah to come closer. Sarah's breath caught as she took in the collection of canvases that dominated the wall. Lisa's work was more than just art. It was a testament to her inner life. Her pieces were abstract compositions that somehow conveyed profound emotion through color and movement. One painting, in particular, was the centerpiece of the series. It was a large, arresting canvas divided into two distinct sections. The left side was a chaotic swirl of dark, angry reds and blacks, a tumultuous storm of color that seemed to throb with a raw, chaotic energy. The right side showed a gradual emergence of light, a graceful progression of blues and golds that hinted at a sense of order and peace evolving from the turmoil. The title card beneath it read simply, "After the Sound." It was a visual representation of the accident, of the moment everything changed. Sarah looked closer, noticing the minute details she had not seen at first. Embedded in the dark, chaotic section were barely discernible words, painted in faint, chaotic scripts. The ordered, light side of the painting, however, was filled with what appeared to be hands forming sign language, a silent, beautiful language emerging from the wreckage. Lisa's hands moved gracefully as she explained her piece, how the words were things she remembered hearing before she lost her hearing. Her mother's voice, music, laughter, and the signs were the new language she had to learn, the one that had become her true voice. A sudden stir at the gallery's entrance announced the arrival of Daniel Hunt. He was impeccably dressed, his powerful presence commanding immediate attention even in this informal setting. The school's headmaster hurried to greet him, leading him on a predetermined tour of selected works. Lisa's face fell slightly, her shoulders tensing again as she watched her father, the benefactor, not the parent, moving through the crowd. Sarah saw the look, the flicker of resignation in her eyes. But then, something unexpected happened. As the headmaster attempted to guide him to another section, Daniel Hunt paused. He said something that made the headmaster look surprised. Then, with a quiet and determined purpose, he walked directly toward Lisa's display. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She watched as Daniel's eyes widened, truly taking in the scope and emotional depth of his daughter's work for the first time. The expression of recognition was unmistakable when he read the title of the centerpiece painting. What happened next was a moment that seemed to suspend time. In the middle of the bustling gallery, with a crowd of people watching, Daniel Hunt slowly, deliberately raised his hands. With movements that were still a little stiff, but imbued with a stunning amount of sincerity. He signed. His hands formed the words he had practiced for weeks, the simple yet profound signs for, "These are beautiful," and "I'm proud of you." The silence that followed was absolute. Lisa's hands, which had been resting at her sides, froze. Her face was a study in pure shock, a complex mixture of disbelief and a flicker of deep, aching hope. For a moment, Sarah feared she wouldn't respond. Then, her own hands began to tremble. With a quiet, hesitant grace, she signed her thanks. It was a small, fragile exchange, painfully basic compared to the decade of unspoken thoughts and emotions that lay between them. But in that moment, as father and daughter looked at each other with an unguarded emotion that neither had shown in years, a fundamental shift occurred. The evening's formal program began. The headmaster took the stage and, after a series of polite introductions, announced the recipient of the Catherine Hunt Memorial Scholarship for Excellence in Visual Arts. The scholarship was an extraordinary opportunity, established by Daniel Hunt in his late wife's honor. Sarah saw Lisa freeze, her expression a mixture of shock, confusion, and what looked almost like anger. The headmaster announced the recipient was Miss Olivia Hunt. Applause erupted. All eyes turned to Lisa, but instead of approaching the podium, she turned and walked quickly out of the gallery. The crowd murmured in confusion, but Daniel Hunt, with a quiet command, followed her out. Sarah hesitated only a moment before going after them. She found them in an empty classroom down the hall. Lisa's hands were flying in a rapid, furious series of signs that Sarah knew Daniel could not possibly follow at his beginner's level. The gestures were sharp and full of rage. Daniel looked helplessly at Sarah as she entered, his own hands making a confused, pleading motion. He couldn't keep up. Sarah stepped forward, a bridge between them. She explained the furious, heartbroken signs, the shock that he had created a scholarship in her mother's name without telling her, the betrayal of him making a decision about her future without her input. Daniel's face hardened, his own sense of pride and a perceived slight overriding his earlier vulnerability. He thought she would be pleased, he said. This was a prestigious opportunity, but Lisa's signs, filtered through Sarah's translation, cut him to the core. He had done this her entire life, she signed. decided what was best for her without ever asking what she wanted. He sent her away for 9 years. She signed, and now he wanted to send her away again. The raw accusation hung in the air between them. Daniel's carefully constructed composure finally broke. His voice was hollow as he admitted that he couldn't understand her. He hadn't known how to help her, how to comfort her. Every time she had tried to tell him something and he couldn't understand, it was like losing her all over again. He had taken the coward's way out, he confessed. He had sent her away because he was terrified of failing her worse by keeping her with him. He had been broken after his wife's death, drowning in guilt, barely functioning. He was not a monster. He was simply a deeply wounded man who had handled his grief in the only way he knew how, by burying it in work and distance. The truth was out. The decade of silence and unspoken pain now laid bare in the quiet classroom. The chasm between them was exposed for all to see. A raw, gaping wound that was now finally, terrifyingly ready to be healed or to be torn apart for good. The furious energy that had filled the classroom just moments before had evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, wounded silence. Daniel and Lisa stood separated by a vast emotional chasm, the physical space between them seeming to grow larger with every passing second. The harsh overhead lights of the classroom illuminated the tears that streamed down Lisa's face and the pained, defeated expression on her father's. The raw, unvarnished truth had finally been spoken, and its weight was almost unbearable. Lisa's rapid, sharp hand movements had slowed, her gestures now imbued with a profound sorrow rather than rage. Her hands trembled as they formed the words, their meaning no less potent for their measured pace. She spoke of her need for him, a 7-year-old girl who had lost not only her hearing but also her mother, and who had been abandoned by her father as well. Her hands conveyed the deep sense of betrayal, of being shipped off to specialized boarding schools with no explanation, with no one to truly see her. She wasn't asking a question now, she was simply stating a painful fact, a wound that had festered for a decade. Her hands fell to her sides, the gesture conveying a final, aching exhaustion. Daniel's face, a mask of control for so many years, was now a portrait of utter defeat. He looked at the floor, then back at his daughter, his body language communicating a complete surrender. The defensiveness was gone, replaced by a devastating self-awareness. He was a man who had built an empire on his ability to solve problems, to be in control, but he was standing face to face with the one failure he could not fix with money or power. He admitted it all, the raw, unfiltered truth of his actions. He hadn't sent her away out of convenience, he explained, but out of a paralyzing fear. He described his state of mind after the accident, how he had been broken, drowning in guilt, barely able to function. He had convinced himself that she would be better off with professionals who understood deafness, who could give her a community and a sense of belonging that he, in his shattered state, could not. He had taken the coward's way out, he confessed, a bitter truth that felt like a physical blow. He had been terrified of failing her worse by keeping her with him. The heavy silence returned, this time filled with the weight of this painful confession. The truth, once so elusive, was now out in the open, and it was devastatingly simple. He had been so consumed by his own grief that he had been unable to be there for hers. The years of silence, the emotional distance, the constant presence of interpreters, all of it had been a monument to his guilt and fear. He looked at his daughter, his eyes holding a decade of unexpressed regret. A flicker of something new appeared in Lisa's expression. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. Her hands moved again, slower now, forming a question that held all the hope and skepticism of her young life. Was this why he was learning to sign now? To bridge the gap? Daniel nodded, a simple final answer. The admission, devoid of any attempt to justify or explain, was more powerful than any speech. The emotional dam had broken, and now the truth could flow freely. A long silence stretched between them, a moment of profound understanding in which they finally saw each other, not as symbols of their past, but as two human beings, a father and a daughter, standing on the edge of a new beginning. Lisa's hands moved again, her movements still slow and deliberate. She spoke of the scholarship, of her mother's belief that art could heal wounds nothing else could touch. Daniel nodded, his gaze unwavering, finally understanding that his attempt to honor his late wife's memory had once again been a misguided effort to control his daughter's life. He looked at the floor, then back at his daughter, and with a painful honesty that stole the air from his lungs, he explained his true motivation. He had seen her Harvard acceptance letter, he said. He had seen her leaving him, and he had been desperate. Part of him had thought that if she went to Paris, he would have one more year to learn how to talk to her before she was gone for good. The admission was raw, vulnerable, and utterly heartbreaking. It was a final, devastating act of humility. For a moment, Lisa stood completely still. Then, her own shoulders slumped, and a fresh wave of tears began to stream down her face. Her hands moved, this time with a gentle, forgiving cadence. She wasn't planning to disappear from his life. She signed. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Daniel's lips. He took a hesitant step toward her, then stopped, his uncertainty returning. But Lisa closed the distance. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him in a fierce, tight embrace. Daniel's body went rigid for a moment, unaccustomed to such intimacy. Then he held her tightly, his own eyes closing against the tears that now fell freely. He held his daughter for the first time in a decade, not as a broken man full of guilt, but as a father who was finally learning the most important language of all. From the doorway, Sarah watched them. Her role was complete. The bridge had been built, and she was no longer needed. She turned and slipped quietly away, leaving father and daughter to their private, overdue moment of healing. The hum of the gallery and the murmur of the crowd were distant sounds now. In the silence of that classroom, a silent love, a language without words, had finally been found. 6 months had passed, and the world now seemed brighter. The crisp Boston air was filled with the joyous hum of graduation. A sea of navy blue caps and gowns dotted the green lawn of Westridge Academy, a testament to years of hard work and youthful potential. Sarah sat in the audience, no longer a professional ghost in the background, but a quiet, invited guest. A deep sense of satisfaction settled over her, a feeling of peaceful purpose that had replaced the gnawing anxiety of the past. Her gaze scanned the crowd, finally settling on 2 figures in the front row. Daniel Hunt sat beside the empty seat that would soon be filled by his daughter. The severe lines of his face had softened, and his posture, once so rigid and imposing, held a new, relaxed quality. The ceremony proceeded with the usual dignified fanfare. Then it was time for the valedictorian's address. Lisa, radiant in her cap and gown, walked to the podium. From her seat, Sarah watched as Lisa began her speech, not with spoken words, but with the graceful, fluid language of her hands. A professional interpreter stood beside her, his voice providing the spoken words for the hearing audience. But it was Lisa's silent performance that truly captivated the crowd. Her gestures were eloquent and powerful, her movements filled with a grace and emotional honesty that no mere voice could match. She spoke of her journey, of a world that had once been silent, and of the courage it took to bridge divides and find a voice. Her hands moved with a beautiful rhythmic flow, telling a story of connection, of art, and of a love that didn't need sound to be understood. From his seat, Daniel watched her with an undisguised pride that was breathtaking to witness. His eyes never left her, every line of his face a testament to his awe and admiration. The closing words of the speech were a masterpiece of quiet, powerful communication. Lisa's hands formed the final signs, speaking of a world that often valued only what could be heard, and of the most important conversations, those that happened in silence. Her final signs were a tribute to two people: her mother, who had taught her that music existed even for those who couldn't hear it, and her father, who had finally learned that love didn't always need sound to be understood. A wave of emotion swept through the audience. Daniel's eyes glistened with tears as he watched his daughter, a testament to her courage and her forgiveness. After the ceremony, the lawn erupted into a chaotic, joyful scene of hugs, photos, and proud family celebrations. Sarah was moving through the crowd when she saw them, a small, united trio. Lisa spotted her first, her face lighting up with a brilliant smile. She beckoned for Sarah to come closer, her hands moving with an excited urgency. Daniel stood beside her, his presence no longer imposing, but warm and welcoming. He had an easy, genuine smile now, one that reached his eyes. Lisa's hands gestured for her father to show Sarah something. He pulled out his phone, a confident gesture, and opened a video gallery. The images showed a spacious, sunlit room, a professional artist's studio filled with easels, paint-splattered canvases, and art supplies. He explained that they had converted the East Wing sunroom of his home into a studio for Lisa, a place where she could create and be inspired when she was home from college. The joy and pride in his voice were unmistakable. But that was not all. Lisa's hands moved with even greater excitement, gesturing for her father to tell Sarah the rest. He put away his phone, a new purpose filling his eyes. He had established a foundation in his late wife's name, he explained. The Catherine Hunt Foundation for Deaf Education and the Arts. It was a foundation that would fund art therapy programs and sign language education, and it would provide scholarships for deaf students. Lisa added, with a proud, final gesture, that all foundation staff would be required to learn ASL. It was a beautiful, full-circle moment, a testament to a family that had found a new, powerful language for their love. They looked at Sarah, their gaze unified and hopeful. Daniel's hands, still learning, but now much more fluid than before, formed a final, powerful sign as he spoke. He told her that they would like her to be a part of it, as their program director. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She stared at them in disbelief. Program director? Her? She was just a freelance interpreter. Lisa's hands moved with conviction, a final, beautiful affirmation of their journey. She explained that Sarah was the one who had taught them that communication was not just about words. It was about actually seeing each other. Sarah looked between them, at the brilliant young artist and the powerful businessman who had finally learned the most important language of all. The offer was not just a job, it was a validation of her beliefs, a chance to make a real, lasting impact. A new chapter was about to begin for all of them, and Sarah knew her answer immediately. She signed and spoke her acceptance, her hands and voice a unified expression of her purpose.